welcome to this very, very interesting panel on the idea of bridging the gap between thought leadership and sustainability as it exists in the scenario in India, as well as some of the other developing nations and the context globally. We have a very, very eminent panel with us to discuss these challenges and the way forward. I'm not going to waste much more time, just dive straight into introducing the panel to you. We have with us Dr. Alexander Dale. He leads the sustainability pillar at MIT Solve at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Solve is basically an initiative with a mission, quite simply, to solve challenges in the areas of social and environmental sustainability. It is essentially a marketplace for social impact innovation as well as environmental innovation. So it's a place where ideators or innovators who have solutions for social and environmental challenges can bring their ideas and be connected to a larger network of innovators, funders, and basically who can help them scale up their ideas. So it's a fascinating idea, and I urge all of you to go read up a bit more about it. Also, very interestingly, he leads the Indigenous Communities Fellowship at Solve, which is a very, very interesting idea of encouraging native innovators across the US. So there's one of the questions that I have today hinges on this particular aspect as well. We also have Dr. Diana Mangalagiu. Apologies, doctor, if I did not pronounce that correctly, but she is a professor both at the University of Oxford and as well as the Neoma Business School in France, and a board member of the Global Climate Forum as well. She has a dual background in both natural sciences, the PhD in artificial intelligence, an MSc in physics, and an MSc in microelectronics, as well as in social sciences with an MSc in sociology and management. So it's a really interesting juxtaposition of both the aspects of E and S in the ESG framework. So it's a very, very interesting combination. She's also been the author of very, very important reports on climate change. And over the past decade, she's been focusing a lot on sustainability and social responsibility in the corporate and public policy lens. So great to have you with us here, Doctor. And thirdly, we have Mahua Acharya, who, as of just about a day ago, has taken on the lead for a new energy company called Convergence Energy Services Limited, which is a 100% subsidiary of EESL, which is Energy Efficiency Services Limited of India, a government-owned company. This company, very interestingly, is going to focus purely on clean, affordable, and reliable energy sources. So we wish her all the best with her new role. Previously, she was Asia Director of the Climate Policy Initiative and the Assistant Director General of the Global Green Growth Institute, which is an intergovernmental organization headquartered in Seoul, South Korea, but has operations in 31 countries. He previously has also worked in M&A roles at ArcelorMittal and before that with the World Bank. So, I mean, the credentials speak for themselves. So I can't wait to hear from our panelists. And I think some of the questions I have today are not just of interest for the larger community here, but of specific interest to me as well. So I'm very keen on hearing the panelists speak on these. Just to start off with, I mean, in general, we want to keep positive tone to the discussion. So let's get the uncomfortable stuff out of the way first. So to all the panelists, my question would be, currently, where is the gap in thought leadership in the Indian context as well as the global context? Is it a case of the innovation and academic ecosystem not being in touch with the requirements of where industry is at? Or is it a case of industry not prioritizing sustainability as a strategic aspect? Or is it a lack of skills and tools available to be able to scale it up? So where is the real gap currently? So maybe we can start with Dr. Diana first and then go to Alexander.
Well, I would say all of the above. So, a lot of interesting things are happening, in the academia. However, I have to say that in the academia space also, you have a lot of publications particularly. You have a lot of interesting things and, the kind of things Alexander is doing in a very academic context, a very grounded context, and I'm sure he's going to talk about that more. That's exactly, where a lot of these very fertile things are happening. However, I have to say that academia, and with its own problems, particularly the publication and the rating of the publications and all of this, you have an ecosystem there which is actually not very fertile in terms of stimulating something which is directly applicable and and stimulating innovation in the ground. So I'm not saying it's academia only to blame, and anyways I think the blaming game is not something we should play anyway. because we are kind of multi-stakeholders at all our levels. Now, in terms of what's happening on the ground, be it business, you have incredibly interesting initiatives happening in the business sectors, and in some of the incumbent companies, some of the incubators, some of the accelerators are really, really interesting and stimulating. But I would say maybe where, gaps, if there are gaps, and there are gaps because the problem definitely, if not, we would not be there talking about all these issues today, it's maybe in the ecosystem, how to make these ecosystems and ecosystem plurals and the kind of coalitions of ecosystems are kind of better getting together.
That's a very, very interesting point to make, especially about the solutions coming up from some of the newer companies versus some of the incumbent companies maybe who are also now catching up. I think that leads into a lot of work that Alexander is doing as well, in terms of a lot of the great ideas seem to be coming from young, smaller innovators or small companies or startups, and not so much the bigger corporations anymore. So this is something that we've also experienced here. So Alexander, that's a great segue for you to also speak about this particular gap over here.
Yeah, I think that, so echoing what Dr. Diana talked about with, it's all of the above in a bunch of these different ways. And I'd really highlight that I think there's a gap in incentives on both sides, right? From academics, there's incentives to publish in higher ranked journals, not necessarily a gap to work on implementation and trying to bring some of these pieces into real world applicability, or even to define the right problems. And I think for a lot of corporates, particularly those larger established corporates, they have a very good market, they've got a very established product. There's often not a lot of incentives for them to change track. I think to this point that the ecosystem also has a gap. One of the major things we see at Solve is we work with so many different sectors. We work with academia, we work with corporates, we work with nonprofits, we work with foundations, we work with this whole set of innovators. And one of the big areas is just seeing that defining the right problem requires all of these different sides to talk to each other, so that the academics are researching questions that are relevant to others, and companies are looking at solutions that are coming from well-grounded community contexts, that are human-centered approaches. There are lots of these different pieces where we need people to be able to talk together, and finding spaces where they can do that in an effective manner is tricky. It is something we try to address with Solve, which certainly sits within an academic institution, but is in many ways very externally facing, trying to work with all these different places. To your point, yeah, we see a lot of different solutions coming from younger, smaller innovators. They're the ones that are often closer to the problem, whether it's within their community, or they're just not as bounded by existing models. They say, here is the problem that I see. I've read a lot of the science. I have a good sense of what's possible here, what's necessary. And I'm going to take this and develop maybe some new technology, but more often it's, some new way of deploying that, a new business model that puts people in the equation, as well as profit as a utility as opposed to the end goal. And then I think a lot of our goal is, how do we bridge the gap to make sure that those ideas actually can get to a place where they can scale up to reach many more millions of lives.
That's a very important point. I think I'm going to stick with Professor Dr. Dale right now. Alexander, there's a follow-up question to that I had, that actually your answers fed into that as well. This is all flowing very neatly today. But we always look at sustainability, and generally we look at global standards and global commitments and global initiatives. And the idea is generally that sustainability has global problems which can be solved by global solutions. But how important is it to have local or indigenous entrepreneurship and local solutions to some of the local climate or sustainability challenges?
Yeah, it's always a tricky balance, right? Because some of the biggest challenges that we face, the climate crisis chief among them, are really global issues, right? If we don't all pull together, to some degree, we won't solve a problem that affects everybody. And particularly, it's going to affect those that did the least to cause the problem the most, right? Look at the hurricanes that just smashed into Central America this week. Two really strong hurricanes in a devastating year back to back. Look at the flooding in Bangladesh and other parts of South Asia in the past year, right? That have just wiped out whole communities. Climate change had a role in making those events stronger, but those communities weren't responsible for driving climate change in any significant way. At the same time, right, there's so many pieces where we know that if we protect ecosystems, we know that if we manage pollution locally, we know that if we address a lot of the sustainability drivers at a local level, those solutions are going to come from a context where they're going to work really well for the local community. They're going to work for the local business community as well. But also we know that the impacts of those have lots of co-benefits, right? They improve economic prosperity, they improve biodiversity, and then they also tend to have lower carbon impacts or make places more resilient towards climate change. And as a result, you can address a lot of the global issues by really focusing locally. And that local focus, I think most importantly, gives you a really strong story that people can connect to. And we need those stories both of what is possible and why this needs to change. And that's often what affects people most directly. So we can motivate either individuals or corporates to change more if we're looking at things that are in that backyard, knowing that those changes can have ramifications and it can be catalytic to scale to much larger levels.
That's very, very interesting, because I think we're looking at the global thing as maybe the marker or the larger vision, or the larger goal to where we have to reach, but filtering it down to more local issues and solving problems for the local community. So thank you for that, Alexander. Dr. Anna, I'll just come to you with about, because you mentioned something, your work on corporate responsibility. And as you're well aware, India is one of the few countries where this is almost mandated by law. So we have a very, very strict corporate social responsibility law, which mandates that all companies must spend 2% of their profits on CSR efforts. And unfortunately, a lot of sustainability is just considered only as part of CSR. So, what generally happens is that a lot of companies are following the sustainability under the CSR purely as a regulatory requirement. Is that necessarily a good thing? Is it a good thing for developing countries to mandate it? And is that going to be a sustainable driver for adoption of sustainable practices? Or is it just something act as almost like a greenwash or a cover up for not being able to do any real work in the areas of climate change or water, some of these areas? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, CSR, mandating or mandatory or voluntary, that's a long story behind it. And if it's becoming more mandatory today in countries like India, indeed, what is really important is what's happening in the ground. I would say hard law, soft law. What is really law, it's what's actually happening. And if the law is not enforced, what's the point? Now, specifically to CSR, I would say the CSR is not enough. And particularly, my experience with what's happening in India in the CSR domain, it's very old-fashioned kind of CSR, looking at it. Mostly inherited from the philanthropic kind of way of looking at CSR, which is frankly not very useful. Altogether, I would say, if you want CSR to have any kind of impact on the ground, look at a company, where its main impact stands. Impact in terms of what we call politely negative social and environmental externalities. There are also sometimes socially and obviously economically positive externalities. But let's stick for a moment with the negative ones and whatever. If if you are a bank and you try to explain me how you sit in a, low energy buildings and you have light bulbs, which are again light energy, low energy and so on, I actually do not care, because that's not exactly happened. What I do care when I'm looking at financial institutions is where do they put their portfolio of investments, and then this, if that's something which is coherent, yes, we can talk about, and when you look, companies, Ørsted, it used to be called Dong, well, they did Danish oil and gas, okay. Well, they kind of really reversed their business model on the head, and today they are, the number one in offshore wind. and they divest. I mean, they have no activities. I mean, they still have a bit, but basically they are going to be out of fossil fuel completely in less than 2 years' time. So that's what I meant, you know, in that way, when a company is serious about its commitment and aware of what's happening in terms of impact, that's okay. And if we call that CSR, we can call it CSR or sustainability strategy or something. But what you put inside, you know, the CSR, do you take into the CSR all the supply chain, you know, and extended carbon service responsibility of the companies and all of that? And do you go where? Do you go to your first tier suppliers, or do you go further away, you know, build the commodities? So all the, I mean, and it's a complex question, obviously, when you start opening up, you know, some companies actually, and actually leaders, even well-intended leaders, they tend to say, oh, you know, where do I put my fingers on? Because in the end, I open it up and I don't know exactly where to stop. So you have also this, I mean, and frankly, I have been working for 2 decades with incumbents and with accelerators, you know, and small companies and even entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs and everything. And there is so much good intentions also in I mean, on the company side, you know, I mean, and again, I was mentioning earlier this blame game. When I talk to environmentalist NGOs, you know, they really play the, you know, the bite dogs, watchdogs, and they say, oh, we should even not be talking to you because you talk to corporations, you know. But I mean, in the same time, we are these multi-players ourselves. We vote, we consume, we invest, we act. So I think you have responsibility of all of these levels.
Okay, thank you for that very, very detailed answer. And actually, that I would like to ask a follow-up to that particular answer. Then, would you say it's a better idea for measuring impact done by companies or their responsibility rather than the dollar amount of the rupees that they spend? Would you rather have impact assessed and have more of all companies or corporates committing to a certain level or a number of, say, a social return on interest or a certain amount of impact? Would that be a better metric rather than the money spent?
Well, I mean, it's a tricky one because, the amount of rupees you put into the different project and the mitigating and the adaptation projects. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad indicator, but then, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, social return on investment and environmental return on investment, and you now in some countries you have, you know, in US, but now in quite a number of European countries you have what we call, you know, benefit corporations, which by design, statutory in terms of legal basically statutes, they go beyond for profit. I mean, it's profit plus social plus environmental. So is that a way, you know, to say, let's look at the social impact? Again, it depends how you, if it's about, you know, looking at, you are serious about what you call the impact of a company, fine, indeed. And we have a number of tools which are available, but also you have to be very careful how you manipulate and you use these tools, because you can make the numbers say many different things. You know, when I'm saying numbers, it could be rupees, but it could be also number of people you know, so-called impact in terms of, you know, social impact and so on. So I would say you have to be careful, you know, it's not like, yes, use social return on investment instead of, you know, number of rupees.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Diana. Actually, you mentioned financial services, and that is an interesting sector to speak about in sustainable, because in the entire ecosystem of growth or innovation in the sustainability sector, the financial ecosystem has a large role to play. Financial services have a large role to play. And I think to Dr. Dale, I'd like to ask this question about just maybe finance could be one of the drivers, but what are the biggest barriers and drivers to scaling up these innovation or sustainable innovation, and especially for developing nations? where some of the ecosystems or some of the frameworks may not be well developed. But what would be the biggest barriers and what would be the biggest drivers for really scaling this up?
So it's a great question. And I think there's a lot of interesting ties with some of the previous work that Dan was talking about. The biggest barriers are to some degree financial, right? Everyone is going to need capital. And we know that particularly for organizations and innovators that are doing social impact as well as profit, they take a little bit longer to get to, profitability maybe. They're not quite they may be focused on that as one of several goals. So we found that they need a particular, additional infusion of capital, maybe right before their Series A, before they can really prove out a lot of these models. So we've launched something we call Solve Innovation Future, which serves as an investing platform to help them get over that jump. I think beyond that, though, a lot of it is finding the right implementation partners, right? We have a solver that has new ways of recycling thin film plastics, so all the plastic bags that you see, turning them into, durable, but also very circular plastic that can replace things in cars. It can replace different materials for shoes. And that's a great material. Making sure that they have partnerships to put that into industrial scale supply chains, make sure that it works with those approaches, right? Coming from the business world, what works at the lab often doesn't work when you put it into a real supply chain. So making sure that they have partners who are willing to take the risks on working with them in facilities, dedicating some staff time, dedicating some line time to trying to get these products to work. And that takes some time, that takes some trust, it takes some investment as well. We've been really lucky to be able to work with some large corporates. General Motors is one example, where they managed to work with that company called BioSelection to work on putting some of their plastics into some General Motors cars. Right? That's a conversation that's happening. It's a long process, but it's something that's really exciting because it means that all of a sudden you move materials from something that is one-time use or petroleum-based to something that is more circular. I think the other area and the other barrier really is, and you mentioned this kind of idea that developing countries often don't have quite as many frameworks in place, but I think that actually is an opportunity for, in our opinion, it's an opportunity as often as it is a barrier. Any company that's trying to address different sustainability aspects in the US has to face a whole lot of licensing requirements. They have to face a whole lot of very entrenched actors that often have lots of control in political systems and whether those licenses go forward. There's often a much more formal situation. Whereas we've seen, right, looking at the rise of mobile money and a lot of mobile-based platforms in sub-Saharan Africa, and I think across South Asia as well, those platforms have allowed so many different forms of interaction and so many new services to be provided, whether it's healthcare, whether it's learning, whether it's sustainability knowledge and supply chain traceability, or connections between farmers and markets that can scale up so much faster because there's still some flexibility in the markets. And I think so, thinking about what the opportunities are, we see that as a case of, I'm waiting to see one of our solver teams start in Kenya or Nigeria, scale up something really amazing, and then move to the US because they figured out all the model and they can just take over some markets here. There's a lot of really good potential there, and understanding that the Global South has so many different opportunities to make some of that happen. I want to actually pick up, if I can take 1 second to just speak to one piece on those targets and setting good goals and what we should measure. There certainly is a space there for science-based targets. I think every company should have a science-based target on climate change, which is a good basis because it is about what is necessary for the problem, rather than I think that's a really important shift. And at the same time, right, we know that the famous quote of what gets measured gets managed. Figuring out just, are you managing these pieces in the first place is a really important step along some of that journey. The more that we can move away from measuring stuff only in monetary terms, whether it's the corporate level or at the national level, is going to be better. But the science-based targets on climate change is something that I see a lot of, as this is going to point people in the right direction at the right level. That also offers opportunity then to think about, right, to the example of Orsted and Dong, thinking about what revenue lines need to grow, what need to change, and what need to be replaced altogether. And then looking for innovators that can help meet those needs. That's where Solve can come in and helping define some of that innovation.
So that's absolutely fascinating, Alexander, because even we've seen as a company moving the idea of carbon offsetting to the science-based targets has actually really changed the way we approach this. Because on one hand, you're always playing catch-up. There's no real incentive to reduce your emission because you can always have a way of offsetting it. But if you have science-based targets, it gives you a very definite way of reducing your emissions. I think that's a very, very valuable point that you made about SBTs. And the next question is linked to some of these innovations that have been there. And I would like both the panelists to speak about them, maybe starting with Dr. Diana. We always see, the focus traditionally is on developing innovations in the supply, sourcing, production stage. But often where the real struggle is in how do you influence sustainable consumption? I think behavior change and sustainable consumption is a really, really difficult thing for corporates to try and influence, because it's not very easy to change the mind of a consumer who's used to consuming products in a certain way. So how can thought leadership really help us in that particular aspect of behavioral change, so changing the mind of the consumer to be more sustainable or to consume more sustainably? So maybe start with Dr. Diana, and then Alexander, maybe you can give us your thoughts on this.
Well, I fully agree with that Dr. Alexander just said on the science-based target, obviously. And if you see, what's happening now with the, women business coalition and the 1.5 degrees, ambitions and science, that's really interesting. And what's really interesting is that when you see the companies which are coming quite quickly on board, now there are companies which are headquartered in India. You have some of the usual suspects, of course, the Scandinavian and so on, but it's interesting to see, really the global south is coming on board. Not all global south, but that's one thing. To your question on behaviors, as you know, some companies, and I worked a decade ago or more with a number of companies, and they were kind of, looking at life cycle analysis and realizing that 80+% of their impact in terms of products once the product is already with the consumer. So like, okay, what do we do with that? And there are several ways to engage with consumers. You have, Barilla Pasta. They what they do, they try to explain you how to cook differently your pasta, in between active and passive cooking, which basically on the face of what's happening with the consumer, it can save somewhere in between 60 and 80% of the emissions, which are in this particular stage. So, it could look just like a little gimmick, but however, it's a way of bringing the consumer in. Then also what you can see, consumers change actually quite a lot, and they become much more demanding. Well, they are a bit schizophrenic also in how much stuff do I want, but I want it sustainable. I can see that all the time, with even my very, committed students. Sometimes they get a bit kind of cognitive dissonance, and how I can do all of the above in the same time. But so then you have techniques of nudging, but that's also quite debatable, So I would say, you enter other ethical dimensions which come here, and who is me as a company to influence whom. So I would say when you go into that space of the consumption, and you can see it everywhere. Typically if you are looking at the energy, it's really interesting that so much happened, on the energy supply. And whenever we go into the energy demand, and even if you look if I come back just for a second, what's happening in academia, you have, in terms of modeling and modeling capacity and capabilities and what's available. It's such a big discrepancies in what you have on the supply side and on the demand side, because it's quite more complex, because you have all these different basically aspects and parameters coming into the play. But I would say it's not company alone, it's not consumers alone, but you have more and more, and business models, they get shaped and reshaped on their head. You have all this, sometimes converging, sometimes completely divergent trends in, going into more sharing kind of economy models and not owning anymore, and which have a lot of rebound effects and so on, because of course you have to look at this. But you have interesting mechanisms of co-creation, co-governance in between all of these different components, the business, the sometimes NGO kind of space, plus the civil society and consumers themselves. I mean, we've seen really fascinating things happening, for example, in the free-floating biking schemes, how you basically bring in a kind of more solidarity-based, a kind of more conscious-based, aspects and behaviors. And sometimes people, they go even more than the extra mile you would think they go.
Absolutely, I think I couldn't agree with you. I think there is often an underestimation of the consumer by many corporates, thinking that they are interested only in price, and they're very price conscious, and they are not willing to make, like you said, a behavioral-based change based on your willingness to be more sustainable. I think with a newer generation of people, you are seeing that people are willing to make a more sustainable choice, even though it may not be necessarily a cost impact. I think maybe Alexander, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the entire idea about sustainable consumption as well, and how innovation can help tackle that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area. We run into it with every challenge that we run at Solve. We did a challenge on circular economy a few years ago, and a big part of the challenge design discussion was, how do you move consumers and behavior change? Similarly, we did a challenge on coastal communities and resilience, which is obviously landscape scale rather than individual purchasing. But how do you move people away from coasts that are going to flood and going to be permanently flooded? Those are both questions of behavior change that are tricky. We talked with a lot of people. I certainly cannot speak to Dr. Dan, as she has much more experience on the sociology side of this. But we're generally skeptical of a lot of the platforms and apps that people will propose. We see a lot of that in the innovation space, but there's so many barriers to adoption. This is one of these areas that has to come from more established systems. Whether that's, I think bike shares are a great example that they've been able to penetrate with very low infrastructure. But at the same time, right, improving transit access also changes behavior because there's simply a better quality of life available. And I think that's one key piece. Is we know that sustainable behavior is driven by that people feel like it's price effective or it improves their quality of life. Right, having more transit access, having an easier time buying sustainable food than buying, fossil fuel intensive pieces makes things easier. I think we have one solver team called Renewal Workshop, which works with large, very known brands to take back pieces, take offsets, and repair them, fix them, and then put them back on sale. And so they offer that as a service to these brands. It allows maybe some of your students, Dr. Diana, to own some of these brands as a secondhand piece without some of the same costs. That obviously is a virtuous cycle. It means that stuff stays in, all these clothing stays in use for longer. It means that people are spending not necessarily as much money, and you don't have to produce more material. That's great. I think, and right, the other piece in behavior change, there are spots when people have changed really fast, right? Witness how quickly we've adopted cell phones and smartphones. That's because we felt like they gave us a higher quality of life. We know that that's true for a lot of the longer term pieces on sustainability and climate change, right? That a climate adapted and climate mitigated world has less air pollution, so people can spend more time outdoors. It has more local foods, so you get to maybe know your farmers, or certainly it's healthier as well. But I think more than that, it's driven by stories, right? It's driven by the narratives that we tell on what are the people in our TV shows doing? What are the people in our movies doing? Are they riding the bus? Are they riding around in private SUVs? Are they, going to local healthcare centers? Are they using some of these different systems? Are they making sustainable choices? And are they talking about why they're doing that in such a way that those choices filter out and they become normalized through society? I think one of the big areas that I look at is that we need more storytellers, or we need to raise up those people that are already doing that humanities work, often in very specific contexts. It's one of the great pieces about working with the Indigenous Communities Fellowship. We see these, Native American, Native Hawaiian, Alaska Native innovators telling stories of of all the great things that their communities have to offer, all the great things that their communities can be, and using technologies, but also using some ancestral knowledge to bring that forward and bring about something that is really well centered in community, but also shows a path to a real. And whereas these are communities that have been marginalized at every turn throughout our history. So, working with them to not focus on those negatives, but focus on this positive future. We can do that all around the world, right? Looking at, here is the story of a great, more sustainable world and why that's a great thing to do. That, by the way, you're going to change your behavior because it's going to be easy and it's going to be good to do. That's something that we should strive for, and ways that corporates can work with media companies to tell those stories more effectively. That will help drive the needle, even if it's not quite as visible as the number of millennials that are buying new products, because even though they're more expensive, that's a small market share and we can reach bigger.
Thank you, Alexander. That's a very fascinating insight, and I particularly like the bit about the storytellers, because that actually is going to be a crux of my last question, because I want us to end on a very hopeful note. And you mentioned storytellers. So we live in an era where youngsters, and you mentioned Greta Thunberg, everybody knows about, but there's a lot of indigenous populations and people and young child activists from various countries who have raised the issue of sustainability and who are trying to pass that message around. I think it has been greatly successful just by bringing more people to the conversation. I think that's been really useful. But they're also fighting against a constant tide of overall global, the mood seems to be, we've taken a few steps back when it comes to sustainability. So what I would love to know from both of your closing statements is 3 things that we really need to be able to really make sure thought leadership influences the next decade that we see, particularly in a post-pandemic world. I know it's very critical. It actually gives us a very unwelcome chance to reset and to make long-lasting changes. So 3 things that you think are absolutely necessary for thought leadership to really, really dictate how sustainability becomes a part of corporate strategy, part of policy, part of and brings everything together in the next decade. So that would be my closing question to both of you. Maybe we can start off with Dr. Diana, and then maybe Alexander, you can just give your thoughts on this.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, thanks, Dr. Alexander, for bringing the question of narrative. I mean, this is absolutely crucial. And I mean, actually, quite a lot of our work been also about, what ecosystem of narratives and whose narratives is getting, and because you have all these things getting said and by whom, and you have also conflicts of narratives and who is taking over at some point, and which narrative can have a kind of transformative action. So I would say first thing, definitely, I mean, inspiring narratives. I mean, I'm not talking about, something which is completely utopic and unrealistic, because that's obviously not it, but really bringing all kind of voices. I mean, we have been working for at least 2 decades, and it's interesting to see that now, even in the very formal processes of the UN-ish kind of things, you have, indigenous and local knowledge start to get, what we used to call gray literature, How gray is gray, I don't know, but so now it stands as it is, it has a position, and all this, what's happening, how people relate to the different visions, and how people can be basically actors of those visions, because you can't build a vision for someone. I mean, so that's one thing, but inspiring. I mean, all these doom kind of narratives, frankly, I mean, when I look at my students and my kids, and sometimes they get so many negativity in terms of messages, I think that's, if I wouldn't believe that's possible to transform things, I would stop immediately, talking and working on sustainability. I couldn't, go into a class and deliver to my students a doom message, doom and gloom message. So that's definitely something which is, I think, very important, which is happening there. Then, we are talking, how to bring sustainability. I would say, sustainability, it's the only game in town it's gonna get mainstream. In a couple of years, I hope, probably longer than that, in reality, we are not going to talk about sustainable supply chain. We are going to talk about supply chain. We are not going to talk about sustainable finance. I think we're going to talk about finance. And definitely, the way going into the investment space and how the investment space, there are a number of actors which are targeting this investor space and bringing it investment space, to something which is much more reasonable and brings a lot of opportunities, and also show that, sustainable doesn't mean less money. It might mean less money at, today or tomorrow morning, but if you take it all together, and we are not talking about returns of investment which are insanely long. You can still have, quick wins, even financial quick wins, and how you can get something in the, in midterm, and finally you have this, something which is on this kind of coherent trajectory, longer term trajectories. So I would stop here. Thank you,
Dr. Diana. Alexander, maybe as uplifting as Dr. Diana's last statement was, maybe we can have something equally uplifting from you as well to close the session.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I want to build on a lot of what Dr. Diana is talking about here. So I want to, if you said three things, so let me give you my three things in bullet points, and I'll explain each of them a little bit. So one is thought leadership to say we don't need any more fossil fuel infrastructure, just no new fossil fuel infrastructure, period. Second is honesty with optimism. And third is having climate as part of every story. We could extend to sustainability as part of every story. So that first one, we know from very, very simple math, the amount of fossil fuel that we already know about is more than we are able to burn if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees. So there is no reason to build new natural gas, new coal, new oil infrastructure. And we should find thought leadership from corporates, from policymakers, from everyone is saying, and this is what the rise of Fridays for Future and that wave of youth activism around the world is saying, no more of this, just stop. And we know that we can win. We know that we can build a much better world without that. Second is honesty with optimism. We know that the world is headed for some dark impacts, right? You look at the number of climate hazards, they are going up, things will get hard. At the same time, we know that every single action that we take decreases suffering. It makes the world better. And we know that we do, exactly to Diana's point, we have the technology to get 80%, 90% of the way there with what we have already. And so much of it is cost effective already with relatively short returns on investment, right? We see the cost of solar, we see the cost of wind just plummeted over the last 15 years. Those are the cheapest sources in so many parts of the world. And even on transportation, we've seen the cost of batteries drop by something like 83% in the last few years. That's amazing. That means that we have all this potential. Not that there aren't challenges, right? Not that there aren't challenges in moving large amounts of people from the sea level rise already baked in. Not that there aren't challenges from dealing with the supply chains for new metals like lithium or cobalt that we need way, way more of. And they're coming from places that have labor issues in some cases. Or we want to make sure that countries that are exporting those aren't taken advantage of in a colonialist sense. But we have the technology, and there's such a positive story that doesn't get told there. And finally, this idea of climate as part of every story. I think we all live in different worlds, right? Some of us focus on healthcare, some of us focus on learning, some of us focus on textiles or automotive or housing. But every single story has a climate piece. And I think to Diana's point, there won't be a climate person in 5 years. I'd pull it sooner to say 5 years, maybe 2 years. Instead, my hope is that every person understands that, oh, when I'm talking about my supply chain, of course it's climate adapted, and here's what we're doing for climate. And that the line managers for the supply chain know what's going on there. And that for the finance folks, of course it's climate aware, because it's a huge materiality risk if we're not climate aware in our investing portfolio. And so, and the idea that every single story that we tell talks about how this will be affected by climate change and how it can be part of the solution. Because I think for every point where you're going to have those impacts, every piece of it can do better. Every piece of it can reduce suffering as a result. There's so much good that's happening now, and it's up to us to uplift that and put that climate narrative in every piece.
Beautiful. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Dan. I think both of you echoed some very similar sentiments about optimism, about not viewing sustainability as an add-on or additional function, but it automatically becoming part of business as usual. And I think we're already seeing, like you said, many companies that have adopted this just purely as a risk mitigation initiative. So I think there is a lot of cause for optimism. And I think I would like to end this panel on that very optimistic note. Thank you so much,